Okay, I think we're ready to start with that.
Rabbi,
Give me 1 second.
Rabbi,
Get
listen,
my framework. Yeah.
about not judging. Didn't we have last week in Pirkei Avot, don't judge someone because you can never be in somebody else's
That's
place.
2 weeks ago, and I quoted what my father said, that you should never judge somebody till you get to their place. And
Yes.
of course, in a literal sense, you can never be in somebody's place, because
Right.
if you're in his place, he's not there anymore. He moved. So that's, I don't know that that's the simple, like, shut in the Mishnah, but yes, we don't judge. It's not for us to judge people, ever. I don't
Certainly
think.
not for me.
It becomes a little bit of an issue. Obviously leaders have to say things on the community to improve them. That's a job. I'll start, since you asked the question. I guess this is the prelude. Rav Moshe Feinstein has like such a funny tshuva. He has a lot of these amazing tshuvas. Somebody asked, is the rabbi allowed to tell people to be quiet in shul? Well, why not? Because we have a principle in halacha that it's better to do a sin. If they tell you that what you're sinning and you continue sinning, it's worse. So mutoshi yushogim yiluim mizidim. However you define shogeg umezid, unintentional. So the rabbi tells people to be quiet. People don't listen. Who are we kidding here? You tell them to be quiet and they talk. So what's the point? You're making people sin more. Maybe he was talking on Rosh Hashanah, where you're not strict. It's appropriate to be quiet from the beginning of Tchiyat Shofar to the end of Tchiyat Shofar. It's like 2 hours. Who can be quiet for 2 hours? So Rav Moshe said, yes, the rabbi has to tell people to be quiet, even if nobody listens, because the job of the rabbi is to set the communal standards, and you have to let people know, and even if they don't listen. An individual, that's a different story. Individual, no. And secondly, he said, no, there are 300 people in shul. So you're right, 298 aren't going to listen, but 2 people will listen. People do listen a little bit. Everybody knows you give a shiur. If one person, gains something, we don't have to lower expectations. So that's just an interesting question. Okay, that's from 2 weeks ago, not to judge people. So we're going to start today. We are in Perek Beit, where with the 5 students of Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai. So last week, if I remember correctly, we left off, we introduced Rav Elazar Hagadol, Rav Elazar ben Hurkinis. And I left off, I sort of maybe began to allude to the answer that I think the answer, the idea that the Gemara says that Rav Elazar Hagadol never said anything that he didn't hear from his teachers. And the Gemara in Sukkah says they once asked him a series of 30 questions, and the Talmud has 2 versions. He either answered 12 and not 18, or 18 and not 12, whatever, it doesn't matter for our purposes. And he said, I didn't hear what my teacher said. I don't say anything original. I just am transmitter of Torah from one generation to the next. And he refused. He was the most unoriginal thinker there was. And then we discussed that when he gave the shiur, when his father came, because, he was a very wealthy, for those who weren't here last week, he was very wealthy, he came from a very wealthy family, very ignorant. At the age of 22, he ran away to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to learn, and the Gemara says he knew nothing. Pirkei Avot Rabbi nothing. He knew nothing. He didn't know Kiddush, Tefillah, Shema. He knew absolutely nothing. In those days, people who knew nothing, not like today, a little bit, because it's you live in the environment. Those days, mamish, people knew absolutely nothing. And he became a great, great scholar. And the brothers wanted him cut off from the estate. What's he running away from the wealthy family? He should work, make money in business. What the Meshuggah learning in the yeshiva there. So his father went to see, and he gave a shiur, and they said they couldn't tell if it was night or day. They hadn't heard things like this even from Moshe Rabbeinu. His insights and his illumination and his new ideas were so astounding. So we said, how can that be? Is this the same person? So you could say it's an argument. It's very hard to say that. Did he say the most insightful things from Har Sinai, or was he the most boring, unoriginal, speaker who just repeated everything he hears from his teachers? So Rav Kook explains he was both. And I always like to say this, he was both. In other words, the way he said it, and the way he translated what his teacher said into modern language. Everything he said was based on what his teachers. He didn't use the same words. He didn't use the same, every person has their own style. He translated the style of his teachers into modern times. So it was totally based on what was, but it was totally original. And I think that's a very rough, the little bit I know about Rav Kook, that fits in very well with his philosophy. But who I do know a little bit more about, and for sure this is the embodiment, of course, Rav Soloveitchik. This is Rav Soloveitchik. That's the definition of Rav Soloveitchik. The most original creative thinker in the Jewish world in the 20th century, perhaps. And so creative, and his insights into everything, into Gemara and into Hashkafa and into Chumash, everything's just super unbelievable. And his language and his bringing in philosophy. And yet Rav Soloveitchik would be the first one to, everything he did is from his grandfather. His grandfather didn't know one thing about philosophy. He didn't hear of Hegel, Kant. He didn't hear of any of these people, his grandfather. But the Rab was carrying on the Masorah of his grandfather. He just translated it into modern terms. I don't know if I mentioned here, but I've mentioned often, especially I tell my students at chat, where most of the kids come from non-observant homes, that the greatness of Rav Soloveitchik is we wouldn't be here. Like we wouldn't have a school. We wouldn't have the day school movement. Rav Soloveitchik, for all his tremendous insights in Gemara, is very nice, but it reaches a very few people really in the world. But Rav Soloveitchik did. He was the first person to demonstrate you could be an observant, 100% observant and 100% American. You go to Harvard and Volozhin. That's what Yeshiva University, that's what they like to brag. Whether it's true is a different question. You're in Volozhin in the morning and Harvard in the afternoon. Is that probably a little bit of a PR there, but okay. The concept, and the Rav embodied that. So that was Rav Elazar Hagadol. He was super original, but his originality was based on our tradition, and that's really the key. That's I guess those of us, myself, whatever it means, modern Orthodox Jews, whatever that is. But that's exactly our role, to translate our beautiful Masorah and tradition into modern terms and to make it relevant. So that was Rav Elazar Hagadol. Okay, so what does he say? Hold on. So that's Kamishi Talmidim Hayu. So we're in the middle of that. The Mishnah 8, at least in my Parak 2, Mishnah 8. So one student was Rav Elazar ben Hyrcanus. Yes. By the way, it's fascinating. Well, the other story that I think we have mentioned, of course, Rav Elazar ben Hyrcanus is involved in one of the saddest and most tragic stories in the Talmud. And that's the debate with Ravi Yoshua on this obscure oven. I'm sure most people are familiar with the story. Probably has come up, but again, most people I think are not familiar with the continuation of the story. Rav Elazar said, if I'm right, the tree should move and the water should flow backwards and the walls should cave in and the heavenly voice should come. And Rabbi Yoshua, who's next in the Mishnah, is his student, Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, got up and said, Torah lo b'shamayim here. Don't give me this. I don't really care. It's unbelievably powerful. Once God gave the Torah, it's a gift. The Talmud says the Torah is a gift. When you give a gift, you have no say over how the person uses the gift. And God has no power over how Torah is. And that's what God wanted. God wanted man to interpret Torah. He wants us to interpret the Torah according to the rules he gave us. But that's, I'm sure many people also know that the Gemara continues thereafter. They asked, one of the rabbis met Eliyahu Hanavi. So it's a metaphor, right? And he asked him, what was God doing? And God was smiling. Nitzchuni banai nitzchuni. My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. God was very proud that even though God said A, the rabbi said B. It's an unbelievable story. It's really so powerful. Of course, the word netzach doesn't only mean they defeated me. It means netzach is eternity. Netzach Yisrael, the eternity of the Jewish people. So basically the eternity of the Jewish people is when the rabbis debate and argue and make decisions, or even quote unquote against God. So Nitzchuni Banai has this double meaning to it. The story continues, really. It was a really terrible thing. Based on this story, we're not going to go into the whole thing now, but it led to the death of Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel was his brother-in-law. He was married to Rabban Gamliel's sister, and the Talmud says Rabban Gamliel's sister, his wife, Rav Elazar ben Hyrcanus' wife, never let Rav Elazar ben Hyrcanus say tachanun. Tachanun, penitential prayers, asking God for a person's needs, because he was afraid he would daven for the death of Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel was the Nasi, the one who put him into cherem. I mean, it was Ravi Yoshua, who was fighting with him. But Rabban Gamliel is the head of the court, and he was the one who excommunicated Rav Elazar Hagadol. Why over such an obscure topic that had zero relevance? Where they're talking about an oven, whether it's pure or impure, 50 years or 40 years after the destruction of the temple. who cared? The laws of purity and impurity had zero, as Rabbi Israel said yesterday. The laws of Tumah V'Tara had zero application. By the way, chapter 2, I see somebody in Pirkei Avot, I'm sorry, chapter 2, Mishnah 8, had zero application, yet they put him into excommunicating over some obscure issue about when you break the oven. But anyways, Rabbi Gamliel died, Rabbi Lazar died, and one day his wife thought it was Rosh Chodesh, but she miscalculated. So he was davening. She didn't have to worry about saying Tachanun. You don't say Tachanun on Rosh Chodesh. And she miscalculated. And when she got back, she saw Rabbi Lezer had his face in his hand like we do. When you say Tachanun, and she said, "Oh, that's it. My brother is dead." And 5 minutes later, a messenger comes. Her brother's dead. It's like, and then the Gemara. This Gemara takes place in the story of Ona'ah. Is verbal oppression. It's in the Mishnah where you can't walk into a store and price an item you have no interest to buy, or you can't remind the Baal Tshuva of his past ways, you can't remind the convert. It's that Mishnah that this story takes place, indicating, mention that this is a story of Ona'ah. Really, this story is a terrible, it has some powerful, beautiful messages, but it's also a very sad story. And the Gemara ends that the Ona'ah, that to oppress a stranger, is mentioned 36 times in the Torah, the most often mentioned idea in the Torah, be nice to strangers. We know that, we all know that, like we were strangers in Egypt. So that's story is very sad, powerful. And most people know the first half of the story. The second half, they don't want to teach that as much. It's not so nice. But the Gemara is clearly being I think, the way I understand the Gemara is being extremely critical of what actually happened. And that's why they put it where they do. And that's sugya. The topic ends with this idea of ona'ah, not to, it begins with ona'ah and it ends that the God has the love of the convert. And anyway, so I wrote about this now in the Daf Yomi cycle. I thought perhaps, I don't know, maybe it's just totally, crazy and not true. It's just, somebody has to be first. That's why Rabbi Lazar is the first person mentioned in all of Shas. Meimetai according to Shema Ba'arvit and Mishash HaKohanim Nichnasim Lachol B'Trumatam Ad Hashma Rishona Diva Rabbi Eliezer. When is the time to say Shema? The first person quoted is Rabbi Lazar. Could be that was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's way of he's the first person we're going to mention. Could be because of his tremendous hatmada, between his tremendous diligence at the age of 22. He's like Rabbi Akiva. We all think of Rabbi Akiva at the age of 40, was totally ignorant and then becomes the leader. We have lots of stories like that. You always have to sort of ask yourself how much of the story is, I don't want to say legend, whatever, but of course, I'm sure, obviously we know it's a little bit true, may not be every little factual point, because that's not the point of the Gemara. The point of the Gemara is ideas and stuff. But anyway, that idea that rabbis, it's not true that you have to be born into a rabbinic family, and it's not true you have to at the age of 4 become great. Listen, look in every other field. In every other field, people decide sometimes to go into the field only in graduate school, and they become the Supreme Court justice. They become great people, and they only decide later in life. You can be a tremendous Torah scholar even if you start later in life. Of course, it's nice to start earlier in life, but it is, I think people have a misconception. In fact, the Gemara says that why is it that often the children of Torah scholars are not Torah scholars? And the Talmud says, in order that people shouldn't think that Torah learning is an inheritance from one generation. Yeah, I'm not from that family, forget it, it's hopeless for me. So the Talmud says, usually you look around and there are very few children of Torah scholars who themselves are Torah scholars. How true that is today, it's very interesting to do a survey. There is a lot of truth to that. I think I mentioned before, Mark Shapiro pointed this out, that of every great Gadol B'Torah at the turn of the 20th century, maybe a little bit before, the 19th century, not one of them had all their children remain observant. I don't want to start mentioning names, but that was the era. The one exception was the Soloveitchik family. That was the only family where each of the children remained observant. Pretty much every Gadol, even some who we knew, in other words, the Gadolim who were born in the 1880s, 1890s, many of them, most of them, and the generation before, all of them had siblings who were not observant. And that's the way of the world. So Torah can always be acquired no matter what age you start. And that's a powerful lesson. And whether Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi put Rabbi Lezer first for that, I have no idea. And I don't know if he knew himself in a certain sense. But of course, that's an idea we can learn. Okay, but let's combine what we're going to have in the Mishnah. Basically, it's very funny. The Mishnah lifts up, these are the 5 students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. These are his 5 main students. And then it's going to tell you, as we know, what are the 5 traits, what's great about each student, the good heart, we'll get there, a good eye. But and then what path we should pick, a good heart, etc. Right? Or he defines who they all are, and then what path. But they first mention the 5 students. So the other, so I mentioned Rabbi Lezer ben Hyrcanus and Ravi Yoshua. Ravi Yoshua, his contemporary, his bar plukta, as we say, the one he disputed with a lot. Of course, Ravi Yoshua is also involved in one of the other most famous disputes. This is a generation of Yavne, of course, and all the disputes in it, not all the disputes, but that was a very, very rocky time. You think about it. It's post-Holocaust, and if I can use that term. The temple is destroyed. The Jewish people are exiled. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. I mean, don't kid yourself. I mean, we say, because we're in the 3 weeks now, we say on Tishva Mizmor LaAsaf, a song, Hashem Goyim Bo Nachlatecha, a song unto Asaf. The nations came into the world and destroyed our temple. So Rashi and Kiddush, what do you mean a song? Well, what's ridiculous? This is a kina. This is a lamentation. So it says, no. It's a song because God took out his anger on sticks and stones. Had God really, really wanted to, do what he should have done, so to speak, he would have killed the Jewish people. But God assuaged his anger, so to speak, by letting the temple burn. Who cares? The temple, sticks and stones. And that's what we discussed last week. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that was our discussion last week. We don't need a temple. We'll recreate it. It's meaningless at that point. We got to recreate Judaism. We went to Yavne. Then the Yavne, so God's anger was taken out on sticks and stones, but nonetheless, some of that anger went to people. It wasn't the hundreds of thousands of Jews were massacred, and the Jewish people were rife. It was full of strife. The Sadducees and the Pharisees. Okay, maybe the Sadducees sort of disappeared a little bit after the destruction of the temple. That's right, and that's why I mentioned. That's why Rabbi Gamliel was such a strong leader. That's why. I'm, in a sense, answering the question on this, they put Rabbi Eliezer into Cherem, in a sense. There were certain issues. Rabbi Gamliel had to put his foot down because he said, otherwise the Jewish people are split. It was under his term that the halacha was established like Beit Hillel. If you want to know a really, really, really tragic story, it's nobody ever talks about this one. Mark Shapiro happened to mention it this week, but which is the Gemara in Shabbos talks about how there was a fight between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, and they put a sword in the base measures, and they didn't let everybody leave. Okay, that's half a problem. The Yerushalmi, the Talmud Yerushalmi, picks up on the story and said, the sword in the Beit Medrash? Yeah, because the students of Hillel killed, murdered, dead, died. The students of Hillel. That day, the students of Beit Shammai killed a number of students of Beit Hillel. And some people say it's not literal, but I don't know why you would say it's not literal. And but other poskim say, absolutely it's literal. So we don't talk about these things for good reason. But it was a very so Rabbi Gamliel had to take a very strong stand, and Rabbi Gamliel had to establish the halachas like Beit Hillel. The Jewish people were in threat of disappearing. So that's why Rabbi Gamliel, that they're saying, the other story is Rabbi Yoshua. That's the famous story. He insulted him 3 times. The most famous one, I think, making him come on Yom Kippur. I've said it 100 times. I don't know, I've said 100 times that with all the fights in the Jewish world, thank God we have one calendar. Thank God Reform and Orthodox and secular and everybody, every Jew celebrates like Pesach on Pesach and Rosh Hashanah on Rosh Hashanah. Can you imagine if Gerach Hasidim celebrated Yom Kippur on a Wednesday and the Misnagdim on a Thursday and the Reform Jews on a Friday? I mean, that would be the end of the Jewish people. That would be the end of the Jewish people. So that's why Rabbi Gamliel had to take a really, really strong stand and make Rabbi Yoshua violate his Yom Kippur to preserve the integrity of the people. So you have to put these stories in historical context. Nonetheless, it was very harsh, and they temporarily impeached Rabbi Gamliel, not permanently. They put him back. So anyways, this is the generation. So you got Rabbi Yoshua, who was often arguing with Rabbi Gamliel, but they're very close. Despite the fact there are many instances where they're very close with each other, you have to be very careful not to cross the line. And that's what the Gemara was saying with Rabbi Lieber and Horkins. They crossed the line when they put them to Cherem. They crossed the line. Rabbi Gamliel did not really cross the line, maybe a little bit. They had to teach him a lesson, but Rabbi Gamliel was effectively correct in his treatment of Ravi Yoshua. And Ravi Yoshua was also, Ravi Yoshua, listened, if you remember the Mishnah says when Ravi Yoshua came on Yom Kippur with his wallet, Rabbi Gamliel gave him a big hug and a kiss. And he said, my student and my teacher, my student, because you listened to what I say, I told you to come on Yom Kippur with a wallet and you came. And my teacher, because you're greater than I am. You're a really greater Torah scholar than I am. So that story does have a beautiful side to it. Now, so that's Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yossi Yaakov and Rishim ben Netanel are much less well known. What do I mean they're much less known? In other words, they don't appear so much in the Talmud. They were whatever. I don't know. Not every student becomes the greatest, They were great students. Believe me, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had more than 5 students. These are his 5 top students. But you don't find too much about Rabbi Yossi HaKohen. Viva Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, that's a later generation. Rabbi Yossi HaKohen and Rav Shimon ben Netanel. That's not the famous Rav Shimon. Whenever Rabbi Shimon appears in the Gemara, that's Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, the famous Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Akiva's the student of Rabbi Akiva. This is a different Rabbi Shimon, not so famous. And then the last person, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, will spend a few minutes talking about him. This is really, really sad. I don't know how to do. People, it's hard to ask, a whole group of people, but if anybody wants to put it in the chat box, if you know the story with Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. He's also very, we're going to see in a few minutes that Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch is the one, according to one opinion, if you put every single rabbi on one side of the, what do you call it? Weight, I forget what it's called.
Balance.
I'm sorry?
Balance.
You put Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, every rabbi, including Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus on one side, and Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, he weighs them down. He's greater than every other rabbi who ever lived. He's unbelievable. And yet, he also almost never appears in the Talmud. We almost never find opinions of his. And the question is, what in the world happened to Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch? Well, this greatest student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, how come he disappeared from Jewish history? So there's a really unbelievable story. This is a Gemara. Don't believe anything I say. I always say, don't. You have to look it up. Don't trust me. Pirkei Avot, I don't do the sources online. Whatever. It's a different type of shir. But I can. Maybe I should do a source sheet. But anyways, the Gemara in Shabbos 147b. If you want to look it up afterwards, the Gemara there is talking about the laws of Shabbat. And we're going to get there in a couple of weeks in Daf Yomi. And it's talking about bathing on Shabbat and drying yourself with towels on Shabbat and exercising on Shabbat. That's the context of the Gemara. So the Gemara tells the story. The Gemara quotes an opinion that you shouldn't drink from the wine of Pirkei. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. And the waters of Dimosont. Again, I don't exactly know how to pronounce it. They say these wines and waters is why we lost the 10 tribes of Israel. That's the statement he makes. We lost the 10 tribes in Israel. In other words, what were people interested in? Drinking wine, partying, bathing, going to bathhouses, which in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, that was a special treat. Only wealthy people could afford bathhouses, and you went. It was a whole thing. Rabbi Gamliel, that's what Rabbi Gamliel said when his wife died, he went to the bathhouse, and they said, how can you do that? You taught us you can't do this. He said, what can I do? I can't help myself. I can't live without taking a bath. Going to the bathhouse, that's too much suffering for mourning, and that's what we assume today, even though the halach is you're not allowed to shower during, Shiva Rachman Litzan. I think, at least where I come from, the poskim who I look up to, and in our world, people, we do shower on not a long, warm shower, but you take a quick shower. We don't do showering as a joyful experience. It's just basic hygiene. So anyways, but so I said they were so interested in the wine and the waters, they got, that's why the 10 tribes were lost. That's not the pshat in Tanakh, but it's the idea, of course, is what if you're too much into enjoying life and you forget about Torah. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch went to this place, went to this went to these waters and stuff, and And you know what happened? He forgot his entire Torah. This greatest of students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai went to hang out, to live in some beautiful side with flowing water and great wine and, the whatever, all these wonderful things. And he forgot his Torah. He stopped learning. He didn't have any colleagues with him. There were no books back then, even if he wanted to stay. So that's it, what can he do? So then it says he came back, I guess after 10 years, he comes back, he comes to shul, and they give him an aliyah, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. And it's Parshat HaChodesh. And remember, of course, in the time of the Gemara, getting an aliyah meant you read from the Torah. They didn't have aliyot. That we put in not to embarrass people, as you'll see, because he embarrassed himself. When you get up to read the Torah, it's embarrassing if you don't know how to read. So we instituted the practice that we have a balkore. But, the aliyah is really the reading of the Torah. That's why the minhag is the person who gets aliyah is supposed to read along quietly with the balkore, because it's really his aliyah. No. So they gave Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch an aliyah. It was Parshat HaChodesh, I guess, or Parshat Bo, whatever. And he read, and as we read, HaChodesh Hazel Lachem. This month for you, this HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodeshim, this is the first month of the year. It's the head of the month. And the Gemara says, instead of reading HaChodesh Hazel Lachem, anybody know what he said? He said, HaCheresh. I'm sorry?
Yeah, I'm saying HaCheresh Lachem.
HaCheresh Haya Libam. HaCheresh. Instead of Chodesh, remember the Dalit and the Resh, right? The Dalit and Resh is very easy to use. So he read Cheresh, which means a deaf person, a deaf mute. HaCheresh, instead of Lachem, he read Libam, the Beit and the Chaf, also very easy, the confused. So it was a very simple mistake. Instead of HaChodesh is Elachem, HaCheresh Haya Libam. But of course, the meaning, their hearts were deaf. Now, this is such a beautiful play on words that the Gemara is saying. In other words, this was Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. He went out to enjoy life. He didn't learn Torah for 10 years. He came back. He was deaf. He was deaf to Torah. Instead of reading HaChodesh Hazel Lachem, he read HaCheresh Haya Libam. And of course, there's a double message. HaChodesh Hazel Lachem is the whole idea of the sanctity of time, how we use our time. That's the first mitzvah given the Jewish people in Egypt. The calendar, the importance of time. That's what I said. To have one people, you need one calendar, right? So they're saying he wasted his time. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. Rabbi Elazar, another tragic story. Tragic story of what can I? Ein chadash tachat Hashemesh. We think today you hear all these stories that they happened. All these stories happened 2,000 years ago too. And I also quote. Mark Shapiro used to say, he told me a few times, I think he's 100% right. People talk about the off the derech, whatever. I don't know if they talk about it as much anymore. I'm not sure, but people going off the derech, whatever term they use. Maybe that's not so popular term anymore. But we are the most on the derech, like generation since the emancipation. Since the last 250 years, what are you talking about? Everybody knows. Think of your parents, your grandparents. I just mentioned all the Gedolim who had siblings who weren't observant. Think of your grandparents or your parents, depending how old you are. Think how many of them remained religious. They came to America. Everybody became non-religious. We in our generation are extremely successful, keeping most people religious, not all. So it's sort of sometimes we focus too much on the negative, not enough. But anyways, that's these are the 5 students of Rocham Zak. I don't want to make it sound maybe I was too negative. He had wonderful students, wonderful Torah came. But it is interesting that this is also part of the greatness of our tradition. Our rabbis are not afraid to say the truth as it is. And of course, the rabbis are talking to us. Look what happened. You can be the greatest Torah scholar. You can be a nobody and become Rav Elazar Hagadol. Become the greatest person and saying things that weren't heard from Mount Sinai, and can come in everybody, the brilliant, genius, and turn into a nobody. Can't even read Hebrew anymore. He could read Hebrew, but obviously he made little mistakes. Okay, so these are the 5 students. So let's discuss a little. Huyam Monesh Vachan. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would talk about the praise of each one. Rabbi Elazar ben Horkin is Bor Sud Sheinom Beitipa. He was like, I think they translate in English different, a plaster cistern that didn't lose a drop of wine. Okay, I'll just go through them quickly, then we'll come back to them. Ravi Yoshua Shrei Yoledato, the funny expression. Ravi Yoshua, blessed is the one who gave birth to him. He had a wonderful mother. Okay, great. What does it say about him? Rabbi Yossi is a chassid. Rabbi Yossi is a pious person. Rav Shimon ben Netanel is a yirachet. He's afraid to sin. And Rav Elazar ben Arach is Mayan Hamit Gaber. He's an overflowing well of water. Always new insights. Talked a little about, again, this Rav Elazar ben Hyrcanus. I said he was like a Mayan Hamit Gaber, but no, he was the one, had a photographic memory, knew everything, never lost a drop. And Rav Elazar ben Arach was a Mayan Hamit Gaber, was a overflowing well. And I'll just read this before we come back. Hu Omer. So Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai would say, if you put all the rabbis, you put them on a scale, and Rav Elazar ben Hyrcanus is on the second side of the scale, Machriyat Kulam. He weighs down everybody. He's the greatest rabbi. Abba Shaul Omer Mishmo. Abba Shaul quoted Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai differently. There was a dispute. What did Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai say? Now, just as a little point, I'm sure most people know the principle, Elu ve'elu divir Elohim chayim. These and those are the words of the living God. So we say that came up originally by Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Who's right? Should we light Hanukkah candles 1 to 8, or should we light Hanukkah candles 8 to 1? The answer is they're both right. They're both right. There's a reason to do this, or a reason that way. We can't do both. Elu ve'elu divir Elohim chayim v'halacha k'Beit Hillel. They're both right, but you're right too. But we have to follow Beit Hillel. So that's when two people, when the Rambam and the Rabbi, I discussed that was the Chiddush of Rav Chaim. I mentioned last week the great insight of Rav Chaim. One of his revolutions was when we say an argument of the Rambam and the Rabbi, it's not who's right. It's the Rambam understood it like this, and then there's conceptually they're arguing about a conceptual point, a theoretical point, and that argument will manifest itself in halacha when it plays in the real world. But it's not a right or wrong question. There aren't people who's right. No, they're both right. So elu ve'elu divir Elohim chayim. However, you cannot say elu ve'elu divir Elohim chayim on a historical matter. You can say it on an interpretive matter. If two people, you want to argue, when did George Washington live? Well, you can't. One rabbi, one historian says he was born in 1698, and one says in 1704. By the way, I don't know when George Washington was born. I'm a Canadian. I assume he was born in the 1700s, because in 1776, I'm assuming he was older than 76 when he became the president of the United States. He had to be. Because anyway, whatever. Okay, so you can't have, or you have sometime in the Gemara, there's a debate. What did Abaye say? What did Rabbi say? So one verse he says this, they're not both right. There's no elu ve'elu divir Elohim chayim. They can't both be right, because we're talking about a historical fact. So one of them is wrong. We just don't know. So Rabbi, it's interesting. It's not even two people quoting Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai apparently said, Rabbi and that Elazar ben Hyrcanus, the one who remembers everything, he doesn't lose a drop, he knocks everything. Now, Abba Shaul said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. It's funny, it's not like two people saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Abba Shaul said in his name, you put all the sages on a scale. Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus, even them. And on this side of the scale, you also have Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus. So he's on this side with all the other rabbis. With Rabbi Elazar b'kaf shniyah. And Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, the Mayana Mikaber, is on the second scale, Machriyat Kulam. He beats everybody. So you have a debate. What's better? Which one is better? So it could be Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did say both of them. It sounds like I'm contradicting myself, right? I just said you can't say no, because it could be, depends what you're talking about. When it came to knowledge, absolutely, Rabbi Elazar Hagadol, nobody came close. All the other rabbis can't compare. When it came to innovation, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, it could be they're talking about two different things. But as all the commentaries explain, what we have here is the famous debate. This debate plays out in Masechet Horiyot, that the Gemara defines it as a Sinai and an Oker Harim. What's better, a Sinai or an Oker Harim? A Sinai means somebody who knows Kol Torah Kula, Sinai. He knows everything. Oker Hari means he doesn't know so much. Not that he doesn't know so much. He doesn't know as much, but he's a great innovator. He can analyze. He's a much better analyst. Listen, somebody just asked, why compare them? Isn't that a danger of embarrassment? So the simple halach is no. In other words, of course, it depends how it's done. The halach is, if you say that Ruvain is a greater Talmud Chacham than Shimon. It's not Lashon Hara. You're saying Shimon isn't the greatest Ruvain. He's not as great as Ruvain. It's not an embarrassment to say that this rabbi knows more than the other rabbi. That's not considered Lashon Hara. Of course, it depends how it's done, I assume. So comparing them, because the reason they're comparing them is they're teaching us what should we do. In other words, when the Talmud has a debate, what's more important, the Sinai or an Oker Harim? So the debate is really what's more important, knowledge or analysis. This is Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. This is in other words, what the Netziv and Rav Chaim, the two great Rosh Yeshivas in Volozhin at the same time. There was a whole fight there, and they had to bring in a whole court who should be the yeshiva, and then the Netziv, who was the grandson of Mary, the granddaughter of Rav Chaim of Volozhin, continues on, and Rav Chaim, the Beis Halevi, first of all, was with his father. They move on, and they leave the yeshiva. And then Rav Beis Halevi leaves, and Rav Chaim comes, and then Rav Chaim marries the granddaughter of the Netziv. So they make shalom. But the Netziv was a traditional Torah scholar. Gemara, Rashi, Tosfot, the Rambam, the Rav, the Rishonim. He wasn't so analytical. It was, said it like it is. Like when I discussed the first approach of Rav Elazar Mazar, just repeat it. But it's more. The Netziv had unbelievable bakiyas. You read his Shiltot. He was the first person. He wrote a work on the Onik work, the Shiltot. His bakiyas, the Netziv knew everything. Unbelievable kid. Rav Chaim didn't have that. Rav Chaim was. I mentioned last week the story. They asked Rav Chaim. Somebody said Tosfot says something, and Rav Chaim said Tosfot doesn't say that. And they asked Rav Chaim, "Do you know every Tosfot?" He says, "No, I don't. But I know Tosfot could never say such a thing." Because he understood Tosfot. He had a Greek analysis. Rav Chaim changed the approach to analysis. Now that's much more popular, because if you don't have to know as much, you in other words, it's much. If in order to have a place at the table of learning, you got to know Gemara, Rashi, Tosfot like inside out by heart. That's very hard. Very few people know that. If you don't have to know that, you just have to think. When I have a sukkah, how do we look at how do we look at this mitzvah? Do we look at it like this? Look at that. You don't need any sort of formal knowledge in a certain sense. And so, but really this debate, knowledge or analysis, Oker Harim, one who can uproot mountains with such innovative ideas, or a Sinai, which is better. And the Gemara says, a Sinai is better. Everybody needs bread. You got to work with the raw materials. The Sinai is the raw materials of the Torah. It's great. After you know the raw materials, then you can innovate. Then you can say new things. But you need to have Sinai first. And that's the debate in the Mishnah. Who's greater, Rav Elazar ben Arach, before he went off, whatever, and Rav Elazar ben Hyrcanus. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, I didn't hear this from him directly, but I heard this from other people I know, said today the style of yeshivot is the Oker Harim. They're much more interested in innovation and Chiddush. So Rav Lichtenstein apparently explained, and it makes a lot of sense, that this debate was when the Torah Shebaal Peh had to be in your head. When there was no Torah, there was no Mishnah, there was no Gemara, nothing was written down. So you pass Torah from a teacher to a student. So the most important thing is knowledge. Today, who needs to know anything? I mean, exaggerating a bit, you just type it in Google and you ask Rabbi Google. Rabbi Google knows everything. Rabbi Google knows more than any rabbi ever alive. And you go to the Otzer HaChachma, the Bar Ilan computer, Shailan, you just type in 17th century chuvas from Poland on Gabrus. Okay. Galician chuvas on machines for matzah. Can you use a machine to bake matzah? You can just type up and whatever you want. And in 1 second, you get 4,000 chuvas on the topic, which will take you 4 years to read. And that's it. So you don't need the Sinai as much. That's why they say that they can focus on Oker Harim, because today it's not so important if you don't. I mean, it is important. But it isn't as important. Rav Shechter used to say, and I guess he would disagree with Rav Lichtenstein on this, Rav Shechter used to say, Gemara and Rashi is 90% of learning. The Chidush and Rav Chaim is all very nice. Anyways, but that's a fundamental argument in learning. What was more important, knowledge or analysis? In a certain sense, we'll leave it at that. And of course, like I said, the Gemara reaches the conclusion of Sinai. Pure knowledge, Bakiyas is great. And of course, you can't do proper analysis unless you have a groundswell of knowledge. That's obvious. But the question is, what should your focus be? I think whatever. I would say I tend more to the Sinai side, but I think people find the Oker Harim, of course, is more interesting, uprooting mountains, new ideas, innovating, like overflowing waters. Say, okay, some innovation men who say isn't grounded in the tradition, isn't authentic, even if we like innovation. So that's as Rav Schechter, when I was in a shir, used the phrase, what's the difference between, Chiddush and Shinui? Chiddush is a new insight, innovation, that's great. To be mechadesh in Torah is wonderful. Shinui, to change the Torah, that's terrible. And like everything in life, there's a very fine line between what's an innovation that's great and what's an innovation that is crosses the line. And I don't have to tell you, different people are going to disagree, which is what I'll take any of the social issues for sure. They're going to disagree, but even in learning, I believe they quoted the name of the Chazon Ish. I believe it was the Chazon Ish who said it. And it says in Kohelet, Ein chadash tachar hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun. Well, I already quoted that earlier, right? There's nothing new under the sun. So I think the Medrash says, Ein chadash tachar hashemesh, but lemala min hashemesh. Under the sun, there's nothing new. Above the sun, there's not. What's above the sun is Torah. Torah, they quote the pasuk in Hazino, Hashem is seer lamo. I don't remember the entire Medrash there, but the idea that there's nothing new under the sun, but there's a lot new over the sun. So what does that mean? So it's the opposite of what we think. In science, there's no inventions in science. Can't invent anything in science. What does scientists discover? The laws of the whole point of science is the laws of physics don't change. The laws of nature are permanent, right? Things don't change. What we do is we discover, theoretically, they could have had a computer 1,000 years ago, but nobody invented it yet. So they could have had electricity a long time ago. Airplanes, you didn't need the Wright brothers, but we build. Science has nothing new. Of course, we think it's very new. It's new and exciting, but it's not really new. It's all exists from Shechit Yemei Bereshit. Everything was put, when God created the world, all of science was embedded into the world, and it's taken us thousands, millions, billions of years, whatever you view in evolution, millions of years for scientists to uncover, or whatever, humans haven't been around that long, but to uncover. Torah is different. Torah that we think we always think the opposite. Science is new and innovative, and Torah, you're just saying over. No, Torah, you can make chiddush, you can make new things. I mentioned this before. I don't know if I'm here. I'll take one famous example. We alluded before that you can't oppress a stranger, a convert. The Torah has that more than any other mitzvah. That story of Rabbi Elazar, Onah. So you can't oppress a convert. So we know, everybody knows that Ruth was a convert. We come from, our Davidic dynasty is based on conversion. David HaMelech, no. Is Ruth allowed to convert? Is Ruth allowed to convert? Of course not. Why can't Ruth convert? It's a pasuk in the Chumash. Lo yavo Amoni u'Moavi b'kal Hashem. You can't come, an Ammoni and Ammonite cannot come into the congregation of God. That's why Ploni Ammoni didn't want to marry Ruth. We can't have, what's going on here? This is against Judaism. It's against the Torah. So they came up with this wild idea. Ammoni, it's written in the masculine, in the tense. Ammoni, a male, but a female can come. Wow. Do you think that's what it means in the pasuk? Is that what the pasuk means? When the Torah says anamani, does it really only mean the man? What's the pshat in the pasuk? We'll leave that aside. It's an important question, but the chita. So they explain it because alvar shar loki nuotchem belechem u'b'mayim, because they didn't come out and give you bread, and it's the men who give the bread. It's the men go out to greet, not the women. So it's only referring to men. Okay, be that as it may. Okay, so the chita was Chaim David Azulay, 18th century. He wrote about 80 books. He was Mashulach, he traveled from place to place, and lots of interesting books. So the Chida writes that that's very nice. When it's what we call, we call this in English a grandfather clause, but it's more than that. Before this teaching that it only applies to men, if a woman had converted 50 years earlier, her conversion would be invalid. It's not that the law at Mount Sinai was that a man can't convert, a woman can. And then they just discovered that law 500 years later. No, the law at Mount Sinai was men and women can't convert. when the rabbi said that we interpret the pasuk to mean that women can convert, at that point the Torah says women can convert. I've discussed this before, that the whole notion of why the Rambam doesn't count in Taryag Mitzvot anything that's derived from the 13 principles of how to derive Torah law. You only count the verse in the Torah. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat Lekadsho you count, but the 39 melachot that are not written in the Torah, that you don't count because they're derived, because that can always change. A Sanhedrin can change. You think the Torah means that, we think the Torah means that. That's what the story is. Torah lo b'shamayim. That's exactly the story we began with. Whatever the rabbis say the Torah is, that's what the Torah is. And when you have a Sanhedrin, that can change from generation to generation. So Torah not only encourages and demands innovation. I mentioned this before. Today, we don't have a Sanhedrin. We've lost in this, and I don't want to get the social reasons, but it's 100% clear. The Reform movement really hurt Orthodoxy. I don't know how to use that term. It froze Orthodoxy. Or Orthodoxy stopped being as innovative because they couldn't be. And Rav Soloveitchik would say it obviously. I can't allow a Shabbos pass by a non-Jew because people will say the conservative movement, you can try. People want this. If there's no conservative movement, Rabbi Soloveitchik would allow to go in Russia, go with the non-Jew in the bus. What's such a big, a Shabbos celebrator? What's the big deal? But it looks like driving the conservative movement. So we have to be concerned of whatever about that. But the halacha is very innovative. The halacha is very innovative. Sometimes it's a shinui, right? So where today that line is, so right. So people debate a little bit. We accept the Talmud, the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, whatever, but I don't have to tell you, probably the number one issue we debate are women's issues. Are woman learning Talmud, that seems to be a chiddush. That seems to be, at least in our world, pretty much accepted. Woman rabbis, not yet accepted, at least in some circles. Maybe in 25 years it'll be accepted. Who knows? We'll see. Anyway, so there is a fine line between chiddush and innovation and shinoi. But that's how we look at science and how we look at Torah. I think sometimes is opposite the way it is. It's like everything; it's complex. Okay, that's that debate. Let's get back a little bit. So Rabbi Lezer ben Hurkanis is he doesn't lose anything. A photographic memory, he knows everything. Great. Or like Ashrei Yoshua, Ashrei Yoledato. I'm gonna Ashrei Ravi Yoshua. Blessed is his mother. So the commentaries explain his mother was a Beethoven fan. Right? Isn't that what they do when you're pregnant? You play Beethoven or Mozart. That's what they used to tell us. You play Mozart music, so the kid in the womb. Psychologists say, from what I understand, the little I know of this subject, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is is kids for sure learn from the second they're born. For sure they're learning already. We know that the second they're born. They're probably even learning in the womb. Whether they're learning Mozart from hearing Mozart, I don't know. But there is an idea, but that's what the Gemara says. Rabbi Yoshua's mother, when she was pregnant, made it her mission to go in the Beit Medrash, to go to shul, that he should already from the womb be in the world of Torah. Whatever that means. That's what the Gemara, that's one idea. That's up there. I don't know exactly. The more normal way of understanding is his mother was a great mother. His mother trained him in Musar and Mitzvot. His mother brought him up to be a tremendous Jew. So the greatness of Ravi Yoshua was because of his mother. It wasn't, he had a tremendous mother who did lots of, put all her power, whatever, into raising him, and in Torah and Mitot Yisharot, and that's what happened. And that's why we praise his mother. It's very interesting, very, very, in a way, very, very beautiful. Rav Yossi was a chassid. What does a chassid mean? So he was pious. So so the commentaries explain a chassid mean acting lifnei meshur hadin, doing more than you have to do. Right, there's a law, we've discussed it already. A few weeks ago, we discussed lifnei meshur hadin, but that's what it means to be a pious person. A pious person does more than they are required to do, always in the relation between man and man. To do more than you're required to do in the relationship between man and God is known as a kadosh. Kedoshim to you. To be holy is generally our relationship between man and God. To be extra pious and to be to act between man and man, lifnei meshur hadin, That's always between people. I'm just going to mute everybody because there's a little bit of noise. If you don't mind, give me 1 second. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. You can unmute yourself afterwards if you want, but at least this way. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, and then Rav Shimon ben Netana was a Yireh, fear sin. So we discussed last week, Ein Amaretz Chasid, lo bur, bur can't be a Yireh. So what's so great is the Yireh? So it's like a bur. Bur means, a bur, a lowlight can't be Yireh. So what's so great is Yireh? So you can say it's still great, as we discussed last week with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. To fear God more than you fear man is really, really hard. I would say, I don't know about you, but I can't reach that level. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was concerned his students couldn't reach that level. To fear God is really, really hard. Yireh. But as we mentioned, someone Yireh doesn't just mean fear of God, it's fear of sin. In other words, to understand that sin is wrong. I'm not fearing punishment from God. That's a lower level. But a Yireh, one who fears sin, so that's already a much higher level. And in this sense, the same way that Rav Yossi was a chassid in his relations between man and man, so Rav Shimon was Yireh. The commentators saying he was very machmir. He was very stringent. He wanted to avoid sin, and he was a Yireh, so he was very careful. And I'll spend a couple minutes on this idea of the role of chumrah. The notion of chumrah is really mentioned in the Torah. That's the whole notion of rabbinic legislation. Asus Yag the Torah, the beginning of Pirkei Avot, the first Mishnah. Anshe Knesset Agdola said, make a fence around the Torah. That's because we have to protect ourselves. You don't go right near the hydro poles. You build a fence, 25 feet away. You don't cross the fence, right? So chumrah is mentioned in Torah. Lo tasur min hadavar, asu mishmeret lemishmarti. You have to listen to the rabbis. So the whole notion of chumrah, not eating milk and chicken, much of Hilchot Shabbos. In other words, we today don't think of it like this, but in the original chumras are rabbinic laws. All the rabbinic laws in the Talmud are muksas, a chumrah. Muksas is a chumrah. We're afraid if you handle a pen, you might write back. So there's nothing wrong with handling a pen. Just I might write. So the rabbi said, okay, don't handle a pen. So that's muksa. That's really a chumrah. Those chumras are accepted as part of the rabbinic our tradition. So we don't call them chumras anymore because they're basic requirements. So chumras are additional things we do today. I don't know whatever your chumrah, whatever chumrah you want to pick on in kashrut. The only thing I'll point out is not a whole shir on chumras is you have to be very careful. You have to be very careful when you're machmir. First of all, very often a chumrah in one area is a kula in the other area. Like the best example, the tragic example today is being machmir minyanim, is being mekil on pikuach nefesh. People who are, it's really, it's getting worse every day, not better. And to be machmir very often, and already I know of two shuls in this week that had to close down, that opened up, and people in the shul have COVID now, and the shuls have closed up. You have to be we have to be I mentioned this many times, to be machmir pikuach nefesh. So often a chumrah in one area is a kula in another area. So that's, you have to be very careful. Or even, let's say a man wants to take on a chumrah, I don't know let's say, even whatever. Yes, how's it going to impact on his family life? How is it going to impact on the children? I mentioned this a long time ago. Rav Lichtenstein said that often when his kids were young, he didn't go to shul every morning. He didn't go to minyan every morning. Take care of the kids, do carpool, change the diapers, give them breakfast, whatever you have to do. So often you have to be very, very careful because chumrah in one area is a kula in the other area. The other issue, of course, is that is a person ready for chumras? If you're not doing the basics, you shouldn't, you have to be on, you can't be very up high in one area and down low in another area. If you don't keep the basics, don't add any chumras. And that's a problem we have. I think it's a psychological need people have, that they know they're weak in certain areas. So in order to be weak, it's a psychological trait. They have to compensate. They overcompensate in another area. So they're very strict here. It doesn't really make sense. Why are they so weak here and so strict there. Well, that's the point. Because they're so weak here, they want to make up for it. They're so strict there. So, you can think, I'm sure, of your own examples. It is human nature. So on the one hand, the machmir tavo of, bracha, that one who is strict, if you're on the level and, it's done appropriately, it is a wonderful thing. Be very extra careful, for sure. If it's for you, it's not for you, don't do it. And on the other hand, you have the problem of yuhara, religious arrogance. He's showing off, what's doing. I don't know if I mentioned, Rav Schachter, when we'd ask Rav Schachter Shir, but he would mention the chumrah. So someone asked him, should we keep the chumrah? He says, I don't know. What else do you do in your life? Do you keep everything else? If you keep all the Daled Chelkei Shulchan Aruch, then you can talk about the chumrah. If you're weak in some area, don't worry about the chumrah. But we know that, for example, Rav Yosef, the Sephardic world, I think Rav Yosef has a tshuva not to wear your tzitzis out. It's inappropriate. It's yuhara. It's showing off, walking with your tzitzis. And today is considered, I'm proud of the mitzvah. I'm not taking a side here necessarily. But I think in the Mishnah Berurah, it says, a yirei shamayim, one who's afraid of God, a fear of God, he should wear tzitzis. So Rav Schachter told us that when he grew up, he was taught the Yirei Shamayim should put their tzitzis out. Yirei Shamayim, Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Moshe Feinstein, they should wear their tzitzis out. Today, every Tom, Dick, and Harry thinks he's a Yirei Shamayim, who, the old joke, but not everybody is a Yirei Shamayim to put out their tzitzis. So you have to be very careful. Chumrah is wonderful, like everything in life. It's how it's used. And the thing that can be the most wonderful, like Torah, can be the most, terrible. So, but Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, he was known as a Yerechek. That everybody knew. Everybody understood. For him, Chumrah was very appropriate. And I mentioned Rabbi Elazar ben Arach was a Mayan Amikaber, and then we discussed, of course, which is better, the innovator or our traditionalists. Yeah. What about a fence around the fence? You're not allowed to build a fence around the fence. Asumi shmeret mishmarti. Build a fence. You're not allowed to be too careful. Sometimes, listen, I think, we hear this a lot, is before Pesach. I know basically all the rabbis basically get up and yell at the balabatim, don't clean too much. Why? Because what happens is people hate Pesach because they have to clean so much and they dread Pesach. Pesach is a yontif, it's simcha, you have to love Pesach. But if you're driving, if you're turning your house, if you had to spend 98 hours to move your fridge, to clean the chametz that even a dog wouldn't eat, that may be hiding under the fridge, you don't have to do that. It's going to ruin your Pesach. And very often people don't listen. So you have to, you have to know when you can't put a fence around the fence. You can't be too machmir. Like I said, that's an area often for Pesach where the chumrah leads to people not liking the holiday. That's a terrible, terrible kula. Zev, I didn't want to talk about kashrut and business ethics, but yes, correct. That's obvious. That's unfortunately, because it's a lot easier to keep kosher than it's, to be honest, in business. As we've mentioned, Rabbi Salanter's story, the truly religious people go into business. People who are not so religious become rabbis, because the rabbis, the temptation to sin is much less. We mentioned this, Rabbi Salanter. To be an honest businessman is really tough, so you better be really religious before you go into that. Okay, let's just, it's getting late. I see already. Time flies when you're having, fun. I don't know how much fun you're having, but I have fun. Thank you. So let's just quickly review what we learned. So we did finish the mission. Next week, please God, we'll pick up on what the traits that each one had. But just to very quickly review, we discussed a little Rav Elazar ben Hyrcanus and the second part of the story, the first part, the beautiful story that Torah is not in heaven. It's up for the sages to interpret, and as we described, to innovate in Torah, to be mechadesh in Torah, even to overrule God if it's done properly. But the second half of the story, when he's put in excommunication and Rabbi Gamliel died, and the sad story of that, and perhaps that's very tragic story. And then we discussed a little bit Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Gamliel also fighting, but in a much different way. And that because of the time, it was very important to preserve the unity of the Jewish people. So Rabbi Gamliel had to take a very strong stand. We discussed the sad story of Rabbi Elazar ben Arach from Hachodesh Hazeh Lachem to Hacheresh Hayat Libam, because if you're too into enjoying, we're supposed to enjoy life. Rabbi Gamliel enjoyed life. Rabbi Gamliel the Nasi, he was very wealthy. Great to enjoy life, but you can't go a place where there are no Torah scholars and no book and sit there for 10 years and and party and think nothing's going to happen to you. That's the tragic story of Rav Elazar ben Aruch, but the debate on which type of learning is better, knowledge or innovation, and maybe today that debate has changed a little bit. I will add, we didn't say that there's a whole discussion that Rav Elazar ben Aruch may be the same person as Rav Meir. This is fascinating because Rav Meir, the Talmud said, was so great that we can't follow him in Jewish law. He was like above everybody else. Meir, he lit up the Jewish people. Rav Meir, and the Gemara in Eruvin says we can't. He knew how to be metaher asheretz, to purify a rodent in 50 ways. He could do things that were wow above everybody, but it wasn't for the normal people. So it's interesting. The Gemara and one view says that Rav Elazar ben Aruch and Rav Meir are the same person. We discussed Likni Mishur Hadin is between God and between man and being a kadosh, a yirachei between man and God, and chumrah has its place, but it's got to be placed properly. You got to do it in the right place. Okay, let me just see if I missed any questions here at the beginning. Eliezer Berkowitz and Rabbi, his brother-in-law, made heaven a sad tragedy. Reish Lakish, okay, I'm fully right. Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan is another tragic story, so close, and Rav Yochanan made a passing, I don't even know that it was an insult, but Reish Lakish took it as an insult, and he died because of it, and then Rav Yochanan died because Reish Lakish died. Very these stories are, what's fascinating is that the rabbis would tell these stories. In other words, the fact that the rabbis put this in the Talmud, like in Bava Metzia, we know how Rav Yochanan brought Reish Lakish back, and the Gemara says they were discussing the purity of a knife. Again, purity, this is so important in that time, even though it's a temple. And Rav Yochanan said, oh, Reish Lakish, you would know about a knife, because the story is Reish Lakish used to be abandoned. So they're discussing, oh, you're the expert on weapons. And Reish Lakish was so insulted, and he died. And soon afterwards, and then Rav Yochanan went crazy. And then they sent somebody to learn with Rav Yochanan. And everything Rav Yochanan said, Chesur said, you're right. And Rav Yochanan said, well, I don't need you to tell me I'm right. Every time I would say something, Reish Lakish would argue with me. I need you to argue with me. Don't tell me I'm right. And Rav Yochanan went out of his mind, and he died. It's an unbelievably tragic story. But again, the fact that the rabbis tell the story, I find fascinating. But the rabbis, you have to think about that. What the rabbis are trying to do here, that they repeat all these stories in the they're not made up. They're not some academic, in the 1800s discovering a manuscript. These are stories in the Gemara that we're talking about. Is there anything in Halacha that requires converts to keep pointing out their converts? No, we're not allowed to point out that a convert is a convert. You're not allowed to point out a Baal Tshuva is a Baal Tshuva. That's exactly when the Mishnah says, Onat Dvarim means to tell a convert, oh, who are you to tell me this? You're nobody. You used to do this, do that. That's Onat Dvarim, to remind the convert of his past. I.e., to say he's a convert, you're not allowed. Sometimes the convert doesn't mind, he gets up, okay, they can be done in a proud way. I've always wondered, how can you have a Baal Tshuva yeshiva? That should be on that Dvarim. You're not allowed to have a Baal Tshuva yeshiva. No, I say this not like, I'm seriously asking the question, because the Mishnah says you're not allowed to say, tell a Baal Tshuva, Zechor Masach HaRishonim. So by having a Baal Tshuva yeshiva, you're announcing these people all used to be sinners. Presumably the heter, run a Baal Tshuva yeshiva, you're not allowed to say it. The Mishnah doesn't say this, but presumably the understanding of the Mishnah is you can't say it in a negative way. Who are you? You're a Baal Tshuva, you're a nobody. But if you say it in a positive way, and a Baal Tshuva yeshiva saying, look how wonderful these people are. They're great. We know Makom Shabali Tshuva Amdim, and Baal Tshuva is greater than someone who didn't sin, is greater than Tzaddik and Mur. So there is something to be said for it, but still, I find it a little bit strange. I think sometimes people say it's a Baal Tshuva yeshiva. They don't really know how to learn there. They're teaching them alphabet. I think that sometimes that's what people think about. Can't really learn in a Baal Tshuva yeshiva. Got to go to Lakewood or Mir, but a Baal Tshuva yeshiva. So you have to be very careful. That would be a violation of Onat Dvarim. Rabbi should have reconciled with Rabbi Elazar the Great. Yeah, okay, that's a story, but maybe we don't have time now. Did they remove the cherem when he died? Okay, we'll have to perhaps discuss that another time. Somebody's writing me privately, people left the derech in the 1880s when there was a choice, neutral. Today, there's also, of course, great choices. That's right. The fact that everybody left was a deep criticism on traditional Judaism. In other words, the rabbis were unprepared for the modern world. So people, if you make a conflict between science and the real world, so people are going to choose like science. At least that's the way it was. 200 years ago. That's why you have to say science is part of the work. God created science, and where there can't be conflict. But for most modern people, yeah, emancipation. And the rabbis or church leaders were saying evolution's all wrong, science is wrong. Just there's most people said that's ridiculous, and they left religion. That's a whole other discussion. But yes, today, Baruch, that's where modern Orthodoxy comes. That's where Rav Shintra Hirsch saved German Jewry, because he said it's not a conflict. Progress and modernity go together. Josephus says 1.1 million. I thought it was 500,000, but thank you for that. 1.1 million people were killed during the siege. Okay, and there were less Jews than there are today in 1939. Elazar ben Aruch became up as Pirkei, right? Why composed him, embarrassed, and we discussed that innovation in Lublin. You should write to write a Chiddush daily. Correct, Morris. That's when I was in Lublin. As such, the Lubliner Rav Meir Shapiro, the founder of Daf Yomi, in the yeshiva schedule, you had to write a Chiddush of Torah. He had a whole schedule of the day. 9:30 at night, I think, for an hour, you had to write your chidushim, what you learned. And if you don't have a chiddush, you have to write something else. The Malamid Lahoel, Reb David Tzvi Hoffman, the great German posek, the greatest perhaps posek in Germany, sort of the modern era, died in 1921, the head of the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary. So in his introduction, his sons wrote the book, the Malamid Lahoel, is Tshuva Sefer. After he died, they wrote that our father told us you should write Torah every day. That's how you learn. And believe me, I do a lot of writing. People see my Divrei Torah. Writing is fantastic. I learned so much from the writing. If you read it, that's a nice bonus. But even if you don't read it, I learn a lot from it. So writing, that's it. And it forces you to put your thought. When I give a share, I can ramble a little bit. When you're writing, every single word's got to be precise. You got to think, you look up things. So there is something, right? That's he was a great innovator. Rav Meir Shapiro, Daf Yomi was a great innovation. We discussed it. Many people were opposed. They're still opposed to Daf Yomi. There is what to be opposed to in Daf Yomi. But there's also fantastic things in Daf Yomi. Okay, could the ban on male conversion have come about because the rabbis feared a language of legitimize the incident at Shechem? Interesting. I know why. First of all, Shechem wasn't. I don't know what that has to do with Ammon or Moab. The ban on had to do with the way Ammon and Moab, treated us in the desert. Now, we read last week when the Jewish people wanted to go in the desert, they wouldn't let them in. That's why I don't think with Shechem. What you have this week, Pinchas, Zimri ben Salu, and Pinchas. That's Shimon and Levi were killing the people in Shechem, and now Pinchas from Shevet Levi leads to 24,000 deaths in the tribe of Shimon. This week is the break between Shimon and Levi, right? Because they work together in Shechem, and Pinchas is from Shevet Levi, and the people who've sinned the Balpor were from Shevet Shimon. That's a whole different like shir, but that's just interesting to point out. I don't think it's connected at all to Shechem, but maybe I'm wrong. No rabbis in Ruth's time. Yeah, not a different type. Shoftim. By Hivimei Shafot HaShoftim. That's correct. The rabbi, this is a private thing. No, there are no rabbis during time of Ruth. So the rabbis say, yeah, Bimei Shafot HaShoftim, people did what they want. But still, you had a Boaz. The Gemara interprets Boaz was like the Rosh Sanhedrin. The Gemara does put a rabbinic base, which may not be the pshat, but there had to be some form of religious leadership. And that was probably, there was a debate. That's why people said we can't accept Root. Going to the base measures didn't work for Esav. That's true. That doesn't always work. Of course, I don't think the Gemara is saying work. That one of the interpretations they say, but it's the idea. You take the kid, and of course, believe me, very often you shouldn't take kids to shul. They make too much noise. The diapers. They see how the adults don't stop talking. They learn you have to be careful sometimes taking adults to shuls. Okay, I apologize. We went a little bit over time, but the questions, nobody has to stay for that. Thank you very much.